Today is June 2nd, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues to edge ever closer to what I would say is more open warfare between the United States, Europe, and Russia, with Ukraine as a proxy more or less caught in the middle. But before we talk about that, let's look at the situation on the ground. We'll look at liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. Keep that in mind as we take a look at it. And the reason, again, why I use a pro-Ukrainian map is so that people can see that even a pro-Ukrainian source is admitting how bad the situation is for Ukraine. So if we zoom in, and as I've pointed out many times before, you will notice that from time to time, depending on when you look at the map, they will have the rifle icons. Red rifle icons mean Russian forces are on the advance. Blue rifle icons indicate Ukrainian forces are on the advance. Right now there are none because it needs to update, but we can take a look at, say, a day or two ago. So this is from March 29th, for example, and it is the same situation today. It just continues to go in this direction. So you can see Russian forces west of Donetsk, west of Avdiivka, continuing to push even further west. All of these areas where Ukraine failed to build proper defensive positions ahead of time, Russian forces just continue incrementally moving in that direction. And you can see that is happening all along the line of contact. In the Donbas region, you can see there is a lot of pressure being put on Seversk here from all directions. It's semi-encircled already. We already know how that is going to end, as we had seen with Bakhmut and Avdiivka. We continue to see Russian pressure and incremental advances toward Kupiansk. And of course, in Kharkov, just northeast of the city, we can see Russian forces continue to apply pressure on Ukrainian forces here. And we continuously hear about how Ukraine has stabilized the front. They've marshaled all of the reserves, and they have stabilized the front. They've stopped this relatively quick Russian advance into Kharkov. But the whole point of Russia doing this in the first place was to tie up these reserves and start grinding them down and depriving them from operating elsewhere along the line of contact, where, as you can see, Russia is also applying pressure. This is what they have been doing all along. This is a strategy of attrition, placing pressure all along the line of contact. A lot of people tried to predict where Russia is going to push through. Honestly, the general staff probably doesn't actually have a specific place it wants to push through. It just looks at where opportunities avail themselves, and then they exploit them. I think that is mainly what is going on here, is overall a strategy of attrition. Of course, the overall objective is to secure the Donbas region in its entirety, to create a significant buffer zone in Kharkov, to prevent Ukrainian strikes on Belgorod, a Russian city, indisputably a Russian city. But they don't seek to create these territorial gains overnight. They are doing it through attrition. They are not doing it through sweeping, big arrow maneuver warfare. With that said, let's take a look at this relatively recent New York Times article. Under pressure, Biden allows Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to strike inside Russia. White House officials said President's major policy shift extended only to what they characterized as acts of self-defense so that Ukraine could protect Kharkov, its second largest city. Now, this whole headline and the general premise this article is written on is nonsense. And it's nonsense even according to other articles the New York Times has written over the last 2 or 3 years regarding special military operation and the U.S.'s role in the fighting. The article says President Biden, in a major shift, pressed by his advisors and key allies, has authorized Ukraine to conduct limited strikes inside Russia with American-made weapons, opening what could well be a new chapter in the war for Ukraine, U.S. officials said. I wonder how they imagine that chapter is going to unfold. Do they imagine that it'll unfold any differently than any of the other times the collective West has attempted to escalate in this proxy war? Now, this has been going on all along. U.S. weapons have been used inside internationally recognized Russian territory, including attacks toward Belgorod, using Western weapons, including American weapons. We remember Western armored vehicles operating inside Russia in these attacks in the Belgorod region. We also remember previous New York Times articles admitting that the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, built from the ground up the Ukrainian military and intelligence units that are conducting operations inside Russia, inside Russian territory, not just Crimea, but across all of Russia. We remember them admitting that, and there's another even older New York Times article that kind of ties everything together. They will not tell you this all openly in a straightforward manner, but if you read through all of their articles and you have a memory of what they have previously written, you put it all together, it's very clear that the US has been directing military operations, armed operations inside Russia, including terrorism and assassinations all along. That is what they've been doing all along, and all the Biden administration is doing now is making it more open and, again, moving this whole conflict toward more open warfare between the US, Europe, and against Russia. Remember this article here. The Spy War, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin for more than a decade, okay? So not just during the special military operation. The United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries in countering Russia. And of course, this was going on for a decade. What they mean is, since the US politically captured Ukraine in 2014, they overthrew the elected government and they installed the client regime in its place. They began militarizing Ukraine, something that they tried to downplay or even deny, but now something they openly admit was being done on a full spectrum level. They were building its intelligence networks from the ground up. The US was doing this for the US to achieve US foreign policy objectives, including encircling, containing Russia, threatening Russia, provoking Russia. I'll get into that a little bit more here in just a moment, but let's read from this older New York Times article from February of this year. The CIA and other American intelligence agencies provide intelligence for targeted missile strikes, track Russian troop movements, and help support spy networks. It's indisputable, and they have admitted this over and over again. All of these attacks using long-range Western weapons are all done using NATO intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting data obtained by NATO, passed on to Ukraine. This is not Ukraine doing it themselves. At most, they're just pushing the button, if even that. But the partnership is no wartime creation, nor is Ukraine the only beneficiary. It took root a decade ago, coming together in fits and starts under three very different US presidents. Again, the continuity of agenda, regardless of who is in the White House and who is controlling the Congress. It was pushed forward by key individuals who often took daring risks. It has transformed Ukraine, whose intelligence agencies were long seen as thoroughly compromised by Russia, into one of Washington's most important intelligence partners against the Kremlin today. So they admit that they were honing Ukraine into a weapon to use against Russia, which is what Russia has been saying all along and is what has predicated its special military operation on. The existential threat that a politically captured, militarized Ukraine represents. The article talks about at least 12 secret locations along the Ukrainian-Russian border that the CIA operates. Okay, so they're right on Russia's borders. Around 2016, again, long before the special military operation was launched, the CIA began training an elite Ukrainian commando force known as Unit 2245. which captured Russian drones and communication gear so that CIA technicians could reverse engineer them and crack Moscow's encryption systems. One officer in that unit was Kyrylo Bundanov, now the general leading Ukraine's military intelligence. No coincidence. Just like the Ukrainian government was put in place by the US, the head of Ukraine's military and intelligence have also been put in their place by the United States. The notion that Ukraine is a country fighting for its sovereignty, self-determination is a myth. Everything that Ukraine declares has been decided in Washington. And the CIA also helped train a new generation of Ukrainian spies who operated inside Russia, across Europe, and in Cuba and other places where the Russians have a large presence. The relationship is so ingrained that CIA officers remained at a remote location in western Ukraine when the Biden administration evacuated U.S. personnel in the weeks before Russia invaded in February 2022. And it also says CIA officers installed equipment at the bases to help gather intelligence and also identified some of the most skilled Ukrainian graduates of the Operation Goldfish program, working with them to approach potential Russian sources. These graduates then trained sleeper agents on Ukrainian territory meant to launch guerrilla operations in case of occupation. And of course, when you're training units to conduct guerrilla operations, you're training them how to do things like sabotage, armed attacks, assassinations, all of the things that Ukraine's military intelligence units have been doing all along. But then it claims the CIA did have red lines. Sure, they did. It wouldn't help the Ukrainians conduct offensive lethal operations. Nonsense. We made a distinction between intelligence collection operations and things that go boom, a former senior US official said. But that directly contradicts what the CIA admitted they were training the Ukrainians to do, which was to make things go boom. Guerrilla operations, that is what that is. It gets worse still. The New York Times itself then contradicts this CIA denial of their involvement in lethal operations because they admit that this CIA-trained Unit 2245 was involved in armed operations, armed attacks on Russian forces. At the time, the future head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, General Budanov, was a rising star in Unit 2245. He was known for daring operations behind enemy lines and had deep ties to the CIA. So how did they draw a line between collecting intelligence and armed operations? They're now literally admitting that they trained this unit to conduct armed operations behind enemy lines. That is exactly what they admittedly were doing. The agency had trained him and also taken the extraordinary step of sending him for rehabilitation at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland after he was shot in the right arm during fighting in the Donbass disguised in Russian uniforms. Then Lieutenant Colonel Budanov led commandos across a narrow gulf in inflatable speedboats, landing at night in Crimea. But an elite Russian commando unit was waiting for them. The Ukrainians fought back, killing several Russian fighters, including the son of a general, before retreating to the shoreline, plunging into the sea and swimming for hours to Ukrainian-controlled territory. So right there, they admit that despite claiming they were only involved in collecting intelligence, they were actually overseeing a military unit conducting armed operations. And then remember this even older article. This is from October 2022. I remember all of these articles. The New York Times, the US government, NATO hopes that you don't remember any of this. US believes Ukrainians were behind an assassination in Russia. And they're talking about Daria Dugina, who was a journalist, and they murdered her. It's a complete craven act of terrorism. It has no justification at all whatsoever. The New York Times itself, the way it words what the Ukrainians did, is almost giving them a pass, if not entirely giving them a pass. In no place in this article do they talk about terrorism or how unacceptable killing a journalist actually is. They're almost trying to justify it, just falling short of openly doing so. It says, United States intelligence agencies believe parts of the Ukrainian government authorized the car bomb attack near Moscow in August that killed Daria Dugina, the daughter of a prominent Russian nationalist, an element of a covert campaign that U.S. officials fear could widen the conflict. The covert campaign that the CIA was specifically training Ukraine to carry out. Okay, so it comes full circle. And it also says, since the beginning of the war, Ukraine's security services have demonstrated their ability to reach into Russia to conduct sabotage operations. These are literally the units the CIA was training and overseeing. The killing of Miss Dugina, however, would be one of the boldest operations to date, showing Ukraine can get very close to prominent Russians. So do you see how they're papering over the fact that this is just craven terrorist? They murdered a journalist. They're acting as if this was somehow a justified part of Ukraine's war with Russia. Then the article tries to claim the United States took no part in the attack, either by providing intelligence or other assistance, except for creating the units that almost certainly were involved in it. American officials also said they were not aware of the operation ahead of time and would have opposed the killing had they been consulted afterward. American officials admonished Ukrainian officials over the assassination, they said, yet they continue training them, arming them, and enabling them to continue carrying out exactly this type of operation, because since they killed Daria Dugina, they have killed other journalists, other politicians in equally craven terrorist attacks. So what does this all add up to? This adds up to the United States already waging armed operations against Russia, inside Russia, for years. And if you recall, the United States was behind the Chechen extremists pursuing separatism that Russia fought 2 wars against inside their own borders from the 1990s to the early 2000s. That was also the United States. So this is nothing new. The United States has been at this for decades now. This green lighting of the use of US weapons inside Russian territory is just doing it more openly, moving the United States one step closer still to open warfare directly with Russia itself. That is what this is a step toward. And they're only doing this just like they did in Syria, the US intervention in Syria, because their proxies are failing. They're collapsing. And now there's panic spreading across Washington, London, and Brussels. They're trying to figure out how they can prevent a complete collapse of their proxies. And again, as I had said from the very beginning of the special military operation, the possibility of a Syrian-style US-led buffer zone in Ukraine, that was always a lingering possibility. That was always something that they were going to consider and attempt to put in place. And this is a step in that direction. Now, another point to consider when talking about the US greenlighting the use of American weapons, European weapons on Russian territory itself, what difference is this actually going to make strategically, tactically and strategically? If all of these weapons being used along the line of contact have failed absolutely to stop Russian success on the battlefield, how is diluting your firepower across a greater area, a greater number of targets, how is that going to improve your situation? It is not. Ukraine is already, according to the Western media itself, for several updates now, all I have done is read headlines from across the West admitting that Ukraine is decisively losing this conflict. That is despite them using ATACMS, HIMARS-guided rockets, these ground-launched small-diameter bombs, Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles, JDAMs, these are the US version of the glide bombs Russia is using, Excalibur, GPS-guided 155mm artillery shells fired by the M777. We remember the M109, the Caesar, the Crab, self-propelled guns that have been transferred to Ukraine, Western main battle tanks, the Abrams, Leopards, Challengers. All of these weapons, wonder weapons, have been sent to Ukraine. They have failed utterly to make any difference in the fighting. If anything, these Western systems sent to Ukraine to replace Ukraine's original arsenal have been a downgrade for the Ukrainians, frankly. How is using these weapons deeper inside Russia going to make any sort of difference? I just don't think that it will. Again, we remember, if anything, it's going to accelerate Ukraine's defeat. We remember the Western media itself, when talking about the Ukrainian drone attacks in Moscow. You remember those drone attacks in Moscow. They made huge headlines. It was an attempt to panic the Russian public, but what they found out was all these attacks were doing was galvanizing the Russian population further. It was giving Moscow greater political capital to mobilize more of Russian society for the war effort. If anything, it just made the situation that much easier for Moscow to more openly and more aggressively pursue this special military operation. The PR victories that Ukraine gains from carrying out these type of operations are very fleeting and in the long term ultimately self-defeating. What does escalating at this time actually achieve? Is it going to help change the course of the fighting in Ukraine's favor? The answer is absolutely not. Is it going to raise the cost for Russia? Yes, possibly. If these weapons are used to take out high-value targets inside Russia, of course, that will increase the cost of this conflict for Russia. You have to remember, though, this was always the objective. I believe this was the objective. I don't think that there was any serious belief that Ukraine could win this proxy war against Russia. Of course, they would love for it to turn out that way, but I don't think anyone realistically thinks that it will. I've cited this many, many times before. It spells everything out in extensive detail. It was published in 2019, extending Russia competing from advantageous ground. And if you read it, there is a section, the first measure, by the way, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. And if you come down here to benefits, it explicitly says, expanding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the cost to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And the whole point of extending Russia is in the hope of precipitating a Soviet Union-style collapse. That is the whole point of this, to encircle, contain, undermine, and eventually collapse the Russian Federation. However, what a lot of people don't know is that this Rand Corporation paper also talked about the risks. Right here under a section titled Risks, they're talking about how provoking Russia into a military intervention, a wider military intervention into Ukraine, might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to U.S. prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, which is now happening, territorial losses, which is now happening, and refugee flows, which are now happening. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which is, of course, inevitable. So was the objective of this strategy of extending Russia by provoking, not preventing or deterring, provoking, deliberately provoking a Russian military intervention in Ukraine, was this meant for Ukraine to survive and win against Russia? No, it was meant to use Ukraine as a disposable proxy to extend Russia, to maximize the cost of the conflict for Russia at the expense of Ukraine being defeated. That is what they're describing right there, the decisive, categorical defeat of Ukraine in that war that they were deliberately trying to provoke. But even this goal of extending Russia does not seem to be working the way policymakers maybe imagined back in 2019. If anything, this has made Russia more resilient, stronger. It has focused Russian society, it has built up Russia's military in a way that it hasn't since Soviet times. It is currently outproducing the collective West across a large range of weapons and munitions. So the idea that they were going to weaken Russia, if anything, has done the exact opposite. Again, the people proposing policies like this often labor under the delusion of American and Western in general military and economic superiority, and they dismiss Russia as backwards and lacking in all of these areas, when in fact they had very clear advantages even before the special military operation that should have given them all pause for thought in pursuing this policy. But they didn't, and that's why they are where they are now. Maximizing the cost for Russia, we can see something similar already long underway on the Crimean Peninsula. The US, Ukraine, NATO have repeatedly said the goal is to isolate Crimea, and I've explained many times how that is impossible. They cannot isolate Crimea, but what they can do is just raise the cost as much as possible for Russia in defending Crimea. And there has been a strike on Kerch port, and I want to show you on the map. This is Ukraine. Here is southern Russia. Here is the Crimean Peninsula, and here is the Kerch Strait. And you can see here, this is the Kerch Bridge, or the Crimean Bridge, and then there is Kerch Port right here. So there was an ATACMS missile strike here on Kerch Port, and according to Russian claims, there were at least 8 missiles launched. And again, these ATACMS strikes, these are done using NATO intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Ukraine at best is just pushing the button. These are operations that are planned long ahead of time. They are coordinated with a large number of assets, and then they are conducted, which is why they don't take place often, because they are major undertakings. We have this article from Kiev Independent. Ukraine hits Russian ferry crossing with ATACMS in Crimea, General Staff says. So this is all according to the Ukrainian General Staff. This was May 30th, 2024. You can see they're showing you satellite images of what they allege is the damage. And you can see there's a scorch mark on this ferry that is still very much afloat. You see the other vessels in the picture are intact. There's another image. I mean, how do you discern the level of damage in any of these pictures one way or the other? You really cannot. The article says Ukrainian military struck the Russian Kerch ferry crossing in occupied Crimea overnight on May 30th. The General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces reported the ferry crossing was hit with US-provided long-range ATACMS missiles. According to the General Staff, Moscow actively used the ferry crossing to supply Russian troops in the occupied peninsula and defended it with Russian Pantsir, Tor, and Triumph, or the S-400 air defense systems, the military said. 2 ferries were significantly damaged. You be the judge looking at that image, those 2 images. The General Staff said, sharing the photos showing traces of damage. One of the ferries was stranded and reportedly blocked the functioning of the entire Kerch crossing, which is absolute nonsense. They also claim at the same time there were maritime drones, part of this overall attack on the Crimean Peninsula. So again, a large-scale operation, almost certainly overseen by NATO, just done through its Ukrainian proxies. They claim that they hit they hit 4 patrol boats, destroying 2 of them and damaging 2 others. So when you hear the word patrol boat, maybe you imagine a big Coast Guard cutter or something, but actually this is what they mean, these little speedboats essentially. And you can even see the bicycle there for scale. This is what Ukraine claims to have destroyed 2 of and damaged 2 others. Now, they carry out attacks like this maybe once or twice a month, sometimes less than that, even once a month, every other month. Successful attacks where they actually are able to damage and destroy a significant amount of infrastructure or equipment. And I've talked about this many times before. If you want to isolate Crimea, you must attack the Kerch port, just the Kerch port, possibly every week, more than 1 time a week, using dozens of missiles, maybe scores of missiles. because you have to damage all of the infrastructure. You need to sink the ferries, and then you need to disrupt attempts to repair and resume operations. But Kerch port is not the only port Russia uses to move people and supplies and goods back and forth to the rest of Russia. They have several major ports where this is done. So Ukraine would have to use scores and scores of missiles every single week to simultaneously attack all of these ports and put them all out of operation in order to isolate Crimea. But it couldn't end there. They also need to destroy the Crimean bridge, which they have been trying to and have been failing to do so. And more importantly, they would need to hit the land bridge, which includes roads and now rail, connecting Crimea to the rest of Russia. And of course, the land bridge is within range of ATACMS, even HIMARS, the shorter range guided rockets. But the point is, you cannot disrupt logistics with these long range strikes alone. You actually have to sever the land bridge, which they tried to do during their 2023 offensive. And we all see what a categorical failure that was. It was outright defeated by Russian forces. They ended up losing more territory than gaining over that period of time that they launched that offensive. Even Russia, despite making many times more long-range precision-guided weapons, struggles to shut down ports, other aspects of Ukraine's logistical networks, airports even, because you strike these targets with large volumes of missiles and drones. It does damage, it disrupts operations, but repairs are then made and then they're back in operation. You have to continuously hit them. So Russia is struggling to do this. Ukraine has no possible way of doing this. They simply don't have enough missiles and drones, and they never will. The West simply does not have enough on hand, nor did they produce enough to achieve this. So they cannot isolate Crimea. What are they trying to do? Again, it comes down to headlines, generating headlines, winning these short-term PR victories, while in the long term, outright losing the war, essentially. Are they raising the cost for Russia, however? Yes, obviously. Every attack, every asset, every piece of infrastructure damage has to be repaired, and that has a cost. So it is overall raising the cost for Russia, which ultimately is the only real objective, only realistic objective the United States and its allies have in this proxy war. Now, let's do an update on the Czech-led artillery shell initiative. If you even remember that there was one, there has been an update. And if you remember, I covered this. The Czech government said that it was going to raise money across Europe to buy artillery shells, 155 millimeter artillery shells, 152 millimeter artillery shells for use of whatever's left of Ukraine's Soviet-era artillery pieces, and other calibers, which people leave out. They think that it's going to be all 155 millimeter shells. No, it's not. They were going to buy these shells from countries all across Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Whoever still has any artillery shells on hand anywhere in any warehouse, regardless of the condition, they're going to scrape together whatever they can find and send to Ukraine. That was the Czech-led shell initiative. And I said at the time when it was announced that these numbers ranging from 800,000 to several million shells that they thought they could get a hold of, I said that the number of shells that are actually of calibers useful for Ukraine will be much smaller than those numbers. And the condition of these shells would be questionable, meaning a large percentage of them would be unusable unless you refurbish them, which will take time and additional resources. Now we have a percentage number on just how many of those shells are unusable and require refurbishment. So this comes to us ultimately from the Financial Times, but this is via Business Insider citing Financial Times. A major ammo supplier to Ukraine says poor quality parts are impacting half, 50%, the shells it's trying to deliver. And the number has gone from 1 million, 2 million, 3 million shells. It's back down to 800,000 shells. And it's almost certainly not going to be at 100,000 shells. This is what the article says. Central Europe's largest ammunition supplier said that quality and cost issues meant that half of the shells it's sourcing for Ukraine can't be sent directly to the country, according to the Financial Times. Czechoslovak Group, or CSG, which has been acquiring ammo on behalf of the Czech government for Ukraine, has found that supplies being brought in from Asia and Africa are often missing components or need work, the paper reported. As such, the company is being forced to add missing components of its own, which has slowed delivery. Remember, they were saying that this month, June, they would be delivering these shells. And they may deliver some of the shells, but the vast majority of them are not arriving this month, next month. They'll be lucky if they arrive within this year. They claim that the initiative is still on track with deliveries expected in June, but not the total number, just deliveries will begin in June. They talk about 5 European leaders meeting in Prague to discuss plans to obtain 800,000 155mm artillery shells from non-EU countries to send to Ukraine, Radio Free Europe, which is US government-funded media, reported. So again, remember, we were hearing pro-Ukrainian analysts, commentators talking about millions of rounds resulting from this initiative. Now, half of the 800,000 shells that they're trying to obtain, at least half, are unusable, need to be refurbished. We have to put this number in perspective also. What does 800,000 rounds means? It means Ukraine had been firing 6,000 rounds, about 6,000 rounds a day before shortages really started hindering daily rates of fire. 6,000 rounds a day was still less than what Russia was firing, who was firing up to 10,000 rounds a day. 800,000 rounds will allow Ukraine to maintain a rate of fire of around 6,000 rounds a day for maybe 4 or 5 months. Between 4 and 5 months. These 800,000 shells are not going to arrive over the course of 4 or 5 months. It'll be stretched out much longer than that, meaning the full rate of fire, the full potential rate of fire, will be less than 6,000. Now, we have to remember that this is not the only source of shells Ukraine has access to. They're still receiving a percentage of the United States and Europe's monthly production. There are no more stockpiles to draw from. They are receiving a percentage of monthly production. So when you add all that up together, that is what's producing their rate of fire. They're firing, according to this article and other articles, around 2,000 rounds a day versus Russia's somewhere between 8 and 10,000 rounds a day, if not more at this point. We heard about this initiative as saving Ukraine, turning the conflict around in Ukraine's favor. I remember it being presented in that fashion. But Scott of Calibrated, who I highly suggest people follow on YouTube and Telegram, the links will be in the video description below. This is what he said on Telegram. He said, if the shells existed, they'd already have been sent. This was what was initially considered unusable. Exactly. They sent everything that they could already. Now they're desperate to find any shells anywhere that they can use, even if they have to repair them, refurbish them. That's what they're scraping together right now. And this is not even a solution. This is desperation in place of an actual solution. This has been Ukraine's problem all along. Not enough shells, not enough missiles, not enough armor, air defense, air power, on and on and on. The West is incapable of fighting a war of attrition at this scale, for this duration, at this intensity. Essentially, it's a war of attrition the West has already lost, but we have to continuously remind ourselves that the goal maybe wasn't necessarily for Ukraine to win. It was to use Ukraine to extend Russia at the complete cost of Ukraine itself, at the cost of Ukraine's defeat. That was always the plan from the beginning. That was the plan. This is what Ukrainians, the trap that they have fallen into working with the United States and the rest of NATO. This is what the US and NATO have done to all of their proxies. Ukraine was not going to be the exception, although apparently somehow they've talked themselves into thinking otherwise. They want to maximize the cost of Russia's inevitable victory. They want to maximize it as high as possible, and they're hoping that maybe something can happen between now and then that precipitates some sort of political, economic, or military disaster. that might then create a cascade effect and possibly collapse the Russian government. This is what they're banking on. Even the objective of extending or overextending Russia, I think we can see, and even as the Western media now admits, Russia is coming out of this politically, economically, and militarily stronger. Not just stronger than where it was before, but stronger in relation to the collective West. It is the collective West, ironically, overextending itself as it pursues this failing proxy war against Russia, and as it maintains all of its other wars and proxy wars around the globe, from the Middle East all the way to the Asia Pacific, where they're trying to provoke war with a much larger and more powerful China. So I will continue covering all of this as it unfolds. I will continue keeping an eye on the conflict in Ukraine. I have another video coming out later this week about artillery shell production and also Russian glide bomb production. A lot of interesting details have been emerging regarding both, so I will be getting into that in depth later this week. I also will talk about the situation on the island province of Taiwan and how the US is trying to push that situation closer to a Ukraine-style conflict in the Asia-Pacific region. In the meantime, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest you follow me on Telegram. Absolutely everything, including backups of all of my videos, are posted in full there. Articles that are censored on X are available there. I also highly recommend people who are looking for daily updates on the conflict in Ukraine, in particular, to follow Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris of the Duran, and also Scott of Calibrated. Mark Sloboda is also an excellent source. I will put the links to all of their work in the video description below in case you're looking for daily updates on the conflict. Also in the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. Feel free to skip past ads. They're not benefiting me at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no extra resources and you're just helping by sharing my work or putting kind comments in the comment section below, sending me news tips, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.